So, Houdini's own help is actually has a really great explanation of how this works. So you can, of course, look at this on your own under the pack primitives thing, but I just want to go through real quick here because the illustrations are pretty helpful. Um, so just for in terms of general instancing stuff, rigid bodies or otherwise, this all applies. This is kind of what we've been describing, where hey, we got 8,000 polygons in one thing. If you wanted to have four of these, well, if it took 1 megabyte for one of them, four of them is 4 megabytes. Whereas under this scheme, one of them, we still have the memory footprint to define it the one time. And after that, we just need these references, these things that say where the tree is, what orientation it is, maybe even what size it is. You can even change materials on a per instance basis, stuff like that. But you're only spending 400 more bytes instead of an entire megabyte, which is a million bytes, on that. So we only end up with costing 1 megabyte plus 1600, 1.6 kilobytes. So it's still essentially 1 megabyte. Moving down, there's lots of more descriptions in here. We talked about how stuff in the viewport works. You can bring it in, as it's saying here. We don't have to even use the full image here. We can actually have it be using an edit packed. We can say, hey, how about we make you actually look like this, like a point cloud. This is easier to draw, obviously, because it's just a bunch of points. You can still get a sense of what it looks like. This is great when you have a lot of these rigid bodies in your scene and you don't want to actually spend the time to render them, even in your viewport. It's like, I get an idea of what these are. I don't need it to actually draw it. But like I can basically look down the line at all 20,000 of them and still have the viewport working. If even that's not good enough for you, you can change this to like the bounding box. Now it's just a bunch of cubes, and now it's fully, interactive. And again, you get an idea of what's going on here. Centroid, because remember, these things are just one point. They are just represented as one point now, and this viewing mode basically just lets you look at it that way. And hidden, well, that means what it means. Let's just leave ours unchanged and get back to this. So that's just a little quick thing about the viewing. This is kind of what I wanted to get to, though. You can, when you have full scenes, of course, you can pack all kinds of different things up. So instead of spending like 50 megabytes for every single, peak that we have, or we have two houses, we would spend 10 megabytes each. Again, this is to beat this point in. Each one of these copies takes up its entire footprint. Whereas under the packed scheme, you only spend it one time. So this number here is just all of these added up. And the references to each one are basically negligible. I mean, 400 bytes is nothing. So furthermore, the camera itself is only going to actually end up viewing these ones. So it's good for the viewport. Later, we'll get into packed disk primitives. Packed disks are pretty cool. These are the ones that we just did here is geometry we made in the scene, and then we packed it. It's packing it in memory right now. If we were to use packed disk, basically it's geometry we write out to BGO files, which is Houdini's native file format. Those BGO files live on the disk, which is what a packed disk is. It's a reference instead of to something in memory, it's a reference to something on disk, which is even greater because in situations like this, it's still wonderful that it's only 63 megabytes, but it did have to load in things like the mountains, and it did have to load in, well, I guess just the mountains aren't ever used. So in this scheme, it never even had to load the mountain. It did load all the trees because some of them are used. Or I mean, it only has to load the tree once, and there's references to it everywhere. In this camera frustum, it never even saw the mountain. So it was like, forget it. Don't even load it. So even better. In many circumstances, they'll probably be roughly the same. Because as long as you see even one instance of each geometry, then it will end up being the same amount. But packed disk is great in general for organization, for just so you don't have to load the stuff yourself in Houdini first. You just write it out to the disk, and then you can pull it in. You can pull it into multiple files, especially if you're on, you have a pipeline and you're using the same things from shot to shot. It's really great. And packed fragments are also, as you can see with the building, a lot of destruction related stuff takes advantage of this. It's largely similar to packed geometry, except that when you have all of these different pieces, it doesn't create, it doesn't embed, it doesn't store that in Houdini in a bunch of different places. It'll just store the whole building in one spot like this. But because each of your fractured pieces will have a different name, it'll kind of be like a sub-memory location for each one of these things. Practically speaking, for you, you don't really have to concern yourself with that too much. It gives us some advantages in terms of simulation and keeping all the memory in one spot. It also allows us to have some attributes can be changed per piece, but for all intents and purposes, just consider it the same thing. There's actually significant downsides to it that you can get into if you do have to delete things later. So I would just say you've got the idea enough if you understand how this works. Great.